What if misery makes us better? Two recent studies illustrate the benefits of depression and war. I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, and this is Right Angle, brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. Well, men, analysis of the personal letters of Beethoven, Mozart, and Franz Liszt seem to show a correlation between the darkest moments of their lives and their most enduring classical works. Love lost, hearing lost, and tragedies in the family which proved devastating to them redounded to their benefit as composers and to ours as music lovers all these years later. In another study, people in Sierra Leone, in the aftermath of massacres, mutilations, kidnappings, and gang rapes of a civil war, have since created stronger, more trusting, more generous communities in which they display more civic and political engagement, even a decade after the war. 19 similar studies in places like Uganda, Burundi, Georgia, Israel, and Nepal have shown similar results, and even victims of violent crime and natural disasters become more engaged in their communities. Researchers from Harvard and the University of Chicago are convinced that wartime violence made these people more cooperative and more trusting. Stephen Green, while common sense might suggest that depressed people become non-productive and war irreparably tears the social fabric, history seems to contradict common sense. What lessons, if any, can we draw from this research?
Well, it's interesting you use that phrase, tear the social fabric. When you're weightlifting, trying to bulk up, you tear your muscles, and then when you put more nutrition back into your body, the building back up of the muscle tissue after tearing is what makes them bigger and stronger. As for the creative impulse, no happy person, creativity is generally a lonely business, especially in things like writing and music. No happy person ever locked themselves in a room by themselves for hours a day, every day until their great work was completed. It's lonely, frustrating work, and I think it's best left to lonely, frustrated people. I once wrote a really bad novel back in the 90s, and I did that just during a really bad stretch of my life. Surprise! Now I have a lovely wife and two handsome boys, and I enjoy cocktails at night. I'm not locked up in the basement all by myself. The other part that interests me, though, is the war thing. Look, when you want to build a football team or a small military unit, like a squad or a platoon, you put people through hell. Football training camp is absolute hell, and it's degrading. Military training is the exact same thing. But the people who come out of that form a team. They form a unit because they've been through the same hell. They've been through the same degradations and deprivations together. So you go to a place that's been through hell like Sudan, and there's a social proof. 100,000 people died, 500,000 people died, but the survivors can look at each other and know. They know without saying a word or asking a word of anybody that they went through the same stuff, and they're a survivor too. There's a built-in social proof. I'm not saying it's a good thing, or I'm not saying it's a desirable thing, but it is definitely a true thing and a real thing. We form these bonds, sometimes in the worst of ways.
Well, Bill Whittle, my pop was part of what we now call the greatest generation. But as far as I can tell, they didn't really start out more special than previous generations. Rather, they had their character tested and forged in the Great Depression and World War II. What does this tell you about the future of our current living generations?
Well, you got a whole bunch of different events going on here, Scotty. First of all, if it turns out that depression leads to creativity, and it certainly seems to in many cases, the United States of America is on the verge of its most amazing renaissance in the history of the country, honestly. After this election, we'll be on the moon, and we'll be on Mars in probably 3.5 weeks. The greatest generation certainly was not different biologically or genetically from any other generation in American history, but you really did answer your own question there. One of the reasons these people were so effective in World War II was because they'd grown up in the Depression. They'd experienced tremendous hardship growing up in the Depression, and the reason they're the greatest generation was they didn't just defeat the fascists and the Japanese in World War II. prior to that, they'd had to survive this horrific situation. I've said this before, at least on Stratosphere Lounge. The only time I ever saw my dad cry in my life was when he was talking about being 12 years old during the Depression and watching his neighbors eating out of garbage cans. So toughness does lead to a sort of a spiritual resilience. But the other part of this equation is the creative side. I used to be an editor on Sunday Morning Shootout. I did 180 shows with Peter Bart and Peter Guber. And one of the recurring themes on this show, mostly as a way of salving, horrible situations, but they would talk constantly about how the unpleasant sets, the sets that were stressful, the sets where the director and the actor were arguing all the time, almost universally produced better work than the harmonious ones. That these forces were in constant tension, and therefore everybody was really at the top of their game. And I think that's certainly true. Certainly, I don't think there's a comedian in the world, a professional comedian, and for that matter, most people with a decent sense of humor, who are not coming from a place of pretty extreme pain, because their sense of humor has been developed over the years to get them out of this kind of mental anguish that most normal people, fortunately, aren't put in. So, as I say, I think if we want to improve American productivity, American creativity, we just run Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump for the next 40 years and just do it again and again and again. And we'll have fusion power. We'll have irrigated deserts with nuclear power, all the things that we want.
We'll be a nation of hulks.
We'll be a nation of hulks, exactly.
Well, there's something broken in the human soul that frequently sets brother against brother. Jealousy, anger, greed, bitterness, idolatry, lust, and revenge lead millions to the slaughter. There's a stain that won't wash out of the fabric of life, that mars even our best moments with a reminder of weakness, sickness, dissatisfaction, and the looming reality of imminent death. When Steve Martin was a stand-up comic, he brought a banjo on stage and joked about how it's darn near impossible to play a sad song on the banjo. And then he picked out a happy tune and sang, "Oh, death and grief and sorrow and murder." Well, our footprints on this mortal coil are tracked. We're hunted by a marksman who always gets his quarry. Nevertheless, if we, as Henry David Thoreau wrote, endeavor to live the life we've imagined, we often meet with a success unexpected in common hours. Eventually, the scientist and the poet might find, if they're willing to consider all the possibilities, that there is a superintending grace over this world, a grace that counteracts even the wicked intentions of powerful men, an unmerited favor that brings life-giving rain even to the soil of the unrighteous, a shaft of sunlight into our cavern of despair. It's a hint of something unseen and yet revealed for the one who has ears to hear. In accepting our own brokenness and acknowledging the glorious design of life, we can find the strength to compose symphonies in the dark and to cling to each other in the wake of, or even the presence of, unspeakable evil. For Bill Whittle, Stephen Green, and the Right Angle team, I'm Scott Ott. Thank you for helping us to sing the songs of light and liberty even as a shadow looms through your membership at BillWhittle.com.